Hey YouTube, just responding to Theo Warner again. He posted another meme. The link to his video will be down in the description. Basically, what it boils down to is that is it a fair characterization of atheists to suggest that we come to our conclusions about the existence of God solely through evidence and arguments, and obviously that would be a really deeply ideological statement. It would be a deeply arrogant statement to say, I believe what I believe because of, for these reasons. The reason why that's an ideological statement, and the reason why it doesn't work, specifically talking about arguments and evidence, is that we as individuals are extremely limited, epistemologically limited. There are two sides here that are important. There's the issue of what I think, right? The issue of what my opinions at this moment on any myriad of issues are, and at all times we must assert our opinions. We must put them out into the world in one form or another. This is obvious. The other question is how I think, which is to say, how in time do I arrive at the conclusions that I will adopt and put out into the world. That latter part, the question of how I think, that's the question that I think renders this meme naive. I, for instance, have very different opinions on any number of issues now than I did 5 years ago, and I actually hope to have radically different opinions in 5 more years. If I didn't, it would mean that I wasn't learning anything, and I wasn't continuing to work on the problems that I'm interested in. So my thinking about these issues is ever changing, and as a result, it becomes really difficult for me personally to it becomes really difficult for me to make strong, positive statements about what I feel about anything at any given moment, without at the same time sort of understanding that these are provisional understandings of whatever issues, and because the important thing is the notion of evidence and argument. What counts as evidence, or what I will accept as evidence, and what I consider to be coherent argumentation, those methodological problems, those are in flux as well. And I think they ought to be in flux, and we can take some certain general rules for granted without having to get into the nitty-gritty of them. But what, for me, constitutes knowledge is something that's also ever-changing. In a certain way, for this reason, I'm really hesitant to self-identify as an atheist, because I think that there's a certain history associated with that term, and I do think that there is a certain culture surrounding that term, and I think it's dogmatic and naive to state otherwise. And that's a history and culture that's one that I find a harder and harder time identifying with, even if I don't necessarily believe in the existence of a deity. Furthermore, and Jacques Derrida pointed this out, there's something brutally... well, he was asked... He says at one point in an essay that I might rightly be considered an atheist. And he was asked, well, why not just say you're an atheist? And he responds by saying, I mean, he goes through a whole thing about how, you know, the people who understand atheism the best are the true believers. In order to have your belief tested in the fire, sort of, you have to go through the most extreme form of atheism and come out the other side. So he tries to break down sort of the distinction between atheism and theism, but then he eventually gets to the point where he says, it's vulgar for me to say I am an atheist or I am a believer. Like, who can say that about themselves? It's arrogant, it's naive, it's dogmatic to be able to make such a determinate statement about how you feel, probably on any issue, especially once we recognize that the goal should be to be constantly changing in a certain way. This is one of the great, I think, revelations of studying philosophy, is that if we decide that there is an answer to a problem and that we've reached that answer, there's no need to think about it anymore. There's no need to deal with it anymore. And I think on one level, philosophy is an attempt to deal with certain problems, but I think on another level, the attempt is to use those problems to transform ourselves and the discourse around us. Again, the distinction between what we think and how we think. That's really important. So yeah, essentially, anybody who is willing to make the claim, I believe this, or to use, I guess, the parlance of the times, I disbelieve this. And that's what I think, and I have arrived at that through evidence and argumentation. It's silly, and I think that we only do it, I think that people only do it in the face of a challenge. I don't think that people do that. Like, I don't ever identify as an atheist unless I'm discussing the subjects, or unless I'm confronted by a Christian, or a Muslim, or whatever. When I'm at home by myself, I don't self-identify as an atheist. So yeah, the notion of when we apply labels is also important also. So, again, something important is the heading of the graph is reasons why I'm an atheist. That second person level of the video, or of the meme, that's what affords the ability to make such an extreme claim. Obviously, it's I, and I'm talking to you, and based on the other answers, the you in that situation is somebody who's trying to characterize me as being merely rebellious, or my reasons as being insubstantial. But that relationship, that second person combative sort of relationship, is something to think about, and how that can force us to distill our beliefs, to freeze frame our beliefs, to crystallize the what we think, and force us into a place of stagnation, I think. That's something that's probably both necessary and problematic. But it's something to think about, certainly. But again, I guess the moral of the story is that I don't really care what anybody thinks on any particular issue. What I'm really interested in is how they think about the issues, how they arrived at the conclusions that they arrived at, and not just as individuals, but within a discursive framework, within a historical era, within a historical context. Those are the questions that interest me, personally. I always almost giggle when somebody really firmly makes a statement of ideology like that. And for anybody who will go so far as to say, oh, atheism isn't an ideology or something like that, it's naive. It's definitely naive. There's a structure to atheism. There's a history to atheism. It manifests itself differently, but it is something that there is an internality and an externality to it. There is. It's a self-contained discourse, and I think it's become more and more so, especially since, the God delusion and such. So yeah, be careful of labeling, I guess, is the moral of the story, and especially when confronted with an other.